Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Kristen Daly. I'm the Executive Director of Global Washington, one of the co-hosts here today. First, I'd like to thank my other co-host, World Affairs Council, Jackie and her team helping out with this event. So Jackie and I actually have been talking about, we're having a bit of a series. Well, we collaborated on an event around animal trafficking last month, and with this topic, and then Jackie's going to take the lead on more of a policy-oriented one around drug trafficking next. So if you're interested, please follow the World Affairs Council and follow up on those topics. For those of you that don't know Global Washington, I'll just tell you briefly. We are a network of 165 nonprofit and for-profit organizations that have a presence in Washington State and do work in developing countries to improve lives. So what we do is act as a trade association for those members, and we often do networking events and events to raise awareness about topics, and we do feature stories that we publish once a year and publish in print form and push out through our monthly newsletters as well. So if you'd like to know more about Global Washington, please sign up. We also have an annual conference that we just opened registration. We have usually about 450 people that come to Bell Harbor down on the waterfront. This year, we're really focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. So our conference is actually going to be rebranded the Goal Makers. The UN has what they call the Goal Keepers, that are celebrities that talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. And we believe that our members are actually the goal makers and advance the Sustainable Development Goals. So you're all welcome to come to the conference. There's more information on our website, and there's a flyer out here on the table as well. So as I mentioned, one of the things we do is dive into a different issue once per month that reflects our membership and is using the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the targets is to focus on anti-trafficking interventions around the world. And so this topic came about too because it's a very specific topic for our members, but also something that is so important and critical. And as we looked at it more and more, it really fell into the category of what we call wicked problems. That term is used in different disciplines, but we see it as those intractable problems that we have to have a comprehensive solution. Because sometimes even one intervention could have unintended consequences. So it's a very complicated problem that we're all trying to solve. And also inaction is probably worse than action that could have unintended consequences. So we have to be thoughtful as we go through this. So that's another reason why we wanted to have this forum so that we could talk about those issues, talk about them from different angles, from a business perspective, from a nonprofit perspective. And I feel very fortunate to have this panel of experts with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, who will then introduce the speakers. You do have the bios of all the speakers and the moderator in your on your program there as well. So we'll take it from there. Kimberly.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Kimberly Davies-Lohman. I'm at Resonance Consultancy at the intersection of international development and sustainability. Forced labor is an issue that we unfortunately focus on quite a bit here. And we really focus on the partnerships between cross-sector partnerships with different organizations. But we're here today because this is such a complex topic, such a wicked issue, that its scale, its reach, its scope, its incentives, that there's just so much that we wanted to discuss and unpack today with this panel and with all of you in the room. As we know, modern slavery can take many forms. Bonded labor, domestic servitude, forced marriage, sex trafficking, focusing on child labor. So it's many types, and it's a very large problem by numbers as well, as many of us know. There are an estimated 40 million people currently today involved in modern slavery, or victims of modern slavery. Of that, about a quarter of them are children, estimated are children, and the majority, or 70%, are women. The US is at a huge risk for importing products that have been made with forced labor, almost $150 billion of products. And from that, it's been estimated that some of the top industries with these products are tech, garments, and fish. things very relevant to our city here in Seattle. So while this is very daunting in a way, I'm also very optimistic because there's a lot of great work that's being done to find some of these interventions. A lot of work being done with all of you in the room and with our panelists here with us today. I'm pleased to introduce these esteemed panelists. You have, as Kristen mentioned, the full bios on your chairs, so we won't go into all of the detail. But I think what's exciting about this panel is just really the diversity and the different perspectives and experience that the three of you bring. Next to me here, we have Shannon Beecher, who combats slavery with data and technology. So really he aims to cut off the demand right at the source. Next to Shannon, we have Swamir's Pirana Guzman with the social service provider, and he serves victims in the Pacific Northwest as a policy expert as well. And then last but not least, Lisa Shannon, who is a women's rights activist who is dedicated to ending violence in women and girls across the globe. So I'd like to dive in here with a question for all of them, and I'll have a question for each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please feel free to think about any burning questions that you have for any of our individuals here. So today's panel is titled Modern Slavery and How to Put an End to Modern Slavery. Very interested to learn what brought you each into this field and what your organization does to help achieve that mission. Shannon, we can start with you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for being here, everybody. I'm Shannon Beecher, and my journey on human trafficking and modern slavery began about 3.5 years ago after I left a career in technology to focus on being a lead parent and volunteer and philanthropist in this space. I attended a UN meeting on Goal 8 and Goal 8.7 in specific, and really learned, my eyes were opened to this phenomenon that Kimberly just spoke to. I thought slavery had ended several hundred years ago, and was alarmed to find how prevalent it was in modern day business and in businesses that I had worked in for over 25 years. When I learned about this, I was drawn to, of course, we all are sort of prisoners of our own experience, and so I immediately thought about technology and how it could be used to help both combat this issue as well as scale. We'll hear lots of dimensions today about how to address human trafficking and modern slavery, but I found a kindred spirit in Justin Dillon, who is the founder of this company, Freedom, FRDM.co, and it's a technology company that focuses on interrogating supply chains, large companies, and it provides procurement offices with data that they might not otherwise have about their supply chains, about the different fronts that might exist in their supply chains, all the way down to the raw materials that go into the product and services that they make available to their customers. So it employs knowledge bases, artificial intelligence, machine learning to put together a view that we think lots of CSR departments and procurement managers don't otherwise have, and if they do have it, they'll make better decisions. As Kimberly talked about, the $150 billion that flow through this as a business, Justin and I share this view that slavery is a competitive differentiator. If you can get free labor to make your products or your services, you can often make them much cheaper than your competitor. And that is the oil that we think lubricates this machine, and so that's what we're going after.
Great. Wow, that's a lot of question. When I started in this world, it's a lot. I was born to a really non-traditional family. My mom is Krishna from Turkey. My father is Muslim from Saudi Arabia. Don't ask me how that happened. They got married. They sought asylum in the U.S. They couldn't get asylum here. They ended up in Honduras, and this beautiful thing was born there. I was born to a really non-traditional family. I consider myself Latino, but I'm not really Latino because my blood is not from there. At the hands of my father, there was a lot of history there, a lot of refugee asylees, and really a lot of family history culture, where I come from, which kind of started me in this global vision of seeing the world from more than not just from my angle, but perhaps a larger perspective. And then the world impacted me. I am a survivor of human trafficking. At the age of 14, I was kidnapped from my home country of Honduras, brought to the US, and in San Diego, California, I was a victim of commercial sexual exploitation of children, sex trafficking, there's many names for it. So I'm here to do a couple of things, to dispel some of this myth that about human trafficking. It happens to all people, anybody coming from all walks of life. But at the same time, perhaps what happened to me kind of drove me to seek an education, to seek to empower those who have been victims of trafficking, and find a way that it's possible for people to become contributing and productive members of society while acknowledging that trauma has impacted people one way or another. At first, I went to go to college and studied law, and then I decided, nope, I need to study the brain to fully understand the impact of trauma has on each individual. So I'm a licensed behavioral psychologist. Over the last few years, I have been working anywhere from providing first-hand services to victims and survivors of human trafficking, providing psychological evaluations to be presented in court. I had the opportunity to work under the Obama administration for 2 years doing policy and work as a member of the National Council on Human Trafficking. That then took me to the global network, and we were able to do a lot of world issues around gender-based violence, human trafficking, slavery, and so much more. I took over the leadership of the Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network, which is now the largest service providers in the Pacific Northwest. We are currently seeing people from 45 different countries speaking 27 unique languages, and these are people from literally every continent of the world who have experienced trafficking either in their home countries or on the way to the US or actually in the US. So that's one way that perhaps we tackle human trafficking at the international scale happening here. I work for the International Rescue Committee, which is the program that I run is a program of the International Rescue Committee. The International Rescue Committee, as you may know, is a refugee resettlement agency that traditionally since 2004 has realized the need to also provide advocacy support and victim assistance support to people who have been impacted by trafficking. So now we have programs all around the country, but also programs in the Balkans and Europe and Eastern Europe specifically for people who have been impacted by human trafficking, mostly around policies, where we are seeing that around the world policies and laws and legislation when it comes to human trafficking seeks to, it has some of those unintended consequences that we have spoken about. And we're going to talk about the politics of human trafficking and so much more. Some of the ways that we address human trafficking, of course, at the international level, there's a lot of education, information, but also being able to provide services hand-to-hand to prevention and education. Prevention without capacity to serve victims is ineffective, it's not valuable. So for those who have the opportunity here to fund programs, think about both doing prevention and capacity. And when it comes to the local level, we provide a lot of education, training, and technical assistance. We are the only agency providing services to all forms of trafficking, sex and labor trafficking. So we have the opportunity to provide services and information across all spectrums of human trafficking.
Yeah, so I came to my work in the international women's movement because I watched an episode of Oprah right before my 30th birthday. And so I was working on violence against women in the Congo, and certainly issues of slavery come up there, in the context of conflict, forced marriage being a very, very soft term for the sort of sexual slavery that happens when women and girls are abducted. I've spent time interviewing Yazidi survivors of ISIS who even use the word slavery themselves did with abducting Yazidi women. So that was my context coming to the work, but it was actually, I couldn't quite articulate what had driven me to even become a feminist in the first place or want to do work with women until I was about 35, so close to 10 years ago. And I was up in Skagit Valley for a speaking engagement on the Congo. And I was picked up from the airport by local folks who were working on trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation here in Washington State. They were telling me about the I-5 corridor, and one of them started describing the grooming process here. How an older boy who's kind of good looking will take interest in someone much younger, call her his boyfriend, start trading her, commodifying her. And I was sitting in the car and I just had this like leaden feeling come over me because I realized that they were describing exactly what had happened to my sister when I was 11 and she was 13. And so she went through sort of the full grooming process. My mom fortunately caught it and stopped it before any money was exchanged. And that boy was eventually kicked out of school and that kind of thing. But I didn't realize that for me, my whole approach to being a women's rights activist actually had started then, when I realized, up until that point I'd gone to modeling school, and why an 11-year-old was wearing makeup is a whole other conversation, but at that point, just stopped all of that. Like, stopped wearing makeup, head-to-toe tie-dyes, totally rebranded myself like hippie girl because being female wasn't safe. And so, that was a really powerful moment for me because I think I realized, as much as I was focusing on the violence that was happening to women over there, I realized how much violence against women is something 100% of humanity is dealing with. When 1 out of 3 women are survivors, we all have people who are close to us and know that really well. So, now I am working on a treaty on violence against women and girls. My co-founder is a survivor of forced marriage. She was born in India, came to the US when she was 2, and when she was 18, started dating a red-headed boy named Billy, and her parents found out and flew her back to India, lots of violence for years until she finally agreed to marry someone just to get a plane ticket home. And so, 20 years later, she left and we co-founded this movement for a global treaty on violence against women and girls. And so, that certainly includes forced marriage, certainly includes some wording that I think is very relevant to trafficking. It definitely addresses a lot of ecosystem issues that people would say are sort of some of the root causes or drivers of some of this violence. And I think the other thing that I would say is that our approach from the beginning, developing this treaty from the grassroots up, is we very much take the approach that was taken when the Disabilities Treaty was developed, nothing about us without us. So when we have approached this, we have absolutely asked from the very beginning that survivors are kind of taking the lead in helping us craft what would be included in the treaty, and that very much has included survivors of modern-day slavery, forced marriage, trafficking. So I can talk more later about some of the specifics that we hope the treaty will address, but that gives you kind of a general sense of how I came to the work.
Thank you all for the introduction to yourself and personal stories, and I think I'll see hopefully why I've been so enthusiastic about this discussion the last few weeks. I think you each touched on some really interesting areas that, well, I wish we had hours, but with the hour that we do have, I'd love to dive into more. Swamir, I'll start with you. You had talked a bit about some of the policy changes recently, and curious how the political landscape has changed and how you think that different actors and collaborations inside politics and beyond may be a part of the solution.
Perhaps when it comes to the issue of politics, right, across the world, human trafficking in the United States, you get a lot of support from both sides of the aisle. Internationally, there's also a lot of support. However, I think that law in the United States, we have a good sense of the law, but when it comes to protecting very specific groups of people who have experienced systematic racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other forms of systematic racism, it's when it becomes a little more of a political conversation. It becomes one-sided over the other and stuff like that. Internationally, I think it's driven by geopolitics rather than kind of like what is a good sense of a law that is actually going to protect people from becoming victims of trafficking, but also are going to receive the appropriate support in and services they deserve to overcome the trauma. I think one of the biggest issues when it comes to the international level is that we acknowledge that human trafficking is this horrible, terrible thing, but we don't acknowledge the actual impact the trauma of human trafficking have on people, the neurobiology of trauma and the impact on the brain, especially to human trafficking. It is one that unfortunately we're not paying too much attention. And human trafficking, unfortunately, over the last 4 years, even in the United States, has become this highly political thing that has been used anywhere from making a border wall argument to making perhaps an argument why countries must take one methodology to addressing human trafficking rather than the other. And of course, recently, I think there's when it becomes even more political is when it gets to specific groups of people, immigrants, undocumented, documented, U.S. citizens, foreign national. Those are all buzzwords when it comes to the politics of human trafficking. Whether if you're addressing human trafficking in general, whether if you're addressing human trafficking in a specific population, people of color, women, men, boys, girls, LGBTQ folks, anybody, right? And that is when it becomes a huge political fight. In 2018, for example, December, the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was reauthorized in the United States. One of the key components that we lost, and we should be terribly upset about this, it is the ability to do vacatur work. As we know, as victims of trafficking, during their trafficking situation, are forced or coerced to commit crimes that they did and as part of their trauma, not necessarily as part of their moral character or because they wanted to engage in a criminal activity. They were forced to do something. That in the past, the TVPA has allowed us to do so to help victims of trafficking clear their records so they can have a better life. Now that has been taken away. That our funding, we receive money from the federal government, the Department of Justice. We are unable to do that. But what we're seeing is that we are seeing clients, specifically those who have experienced sex trafficking, especially women of color. They have anywhere between 13 to 24 prostitution convictions, records, arrests, and all that stuff. And that is actually something that has impacted people. If this was Arizona, a prostitution charge will stay with you for 99 years. That's a death sentence. When it comes to collaboration, for example, I'm sorry, I'm jumping for one another because I don't have that much time. Working in collaboration it's absolutely where it's at. But a multidisciplinary collaboration, having the public sector, the private sector, law enforcement, community members. I invite you, if you're interested, at the local level, my office oversees what's called the Washington Advisory Committee on Trafficking. My colleague Vanessa Hansberger is sitting in the back. She oversees that local task force that brings all the key players. We have hospitals at that table. We have social service providers. We have FBI, HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, anyone who's anybody, they have the opportunity to provide victims to victims of trafficking services or some type of support are at the table. That is how we enhance our ability to ensure that the victims of trafficking receive justice, however they define it, receive the support, and are able to rebuild their life without re-victimization. And that is something that I think we are not, unfortunately, not every state, not every city has a task force that brings all those players at the table. For us, we have seen that having that many people at the table is where it's at, right? We see victims of trafficking who are receiving services from our office, who are actively participating in investigation and prosecution of their trafficking case, are 10 to 20% more likely to be fully cooperative and be able to fully emerge into the investigation and prosecution of their case when there's a service provider providing them services. So what we see, if law enforcement want to prosecute somebody, the best way to do that is to work in collaboration with service providers, local, private and public sectors, who have the ability to provide some type of service to victims and survivors of trafficking.
Great point, Commander. Thank you. Lisa, I have a question for you. One statement that you said really was terrifying and resonated that it's not safe to be a woman anymore, that it wasn't safe to be female. Yeah. And just would like you to unpack more about how women and girls are disproportionately affected by trafficking, and what treaties and programs are in place that may or may not be supporting efforts now.
Sure. Yeah, so, I mean, to begin with, the question of modern day slavery and whether or not forced marriage has been included is something that has evolved recently. So in 2016, there was a big report that was done, and they very much included forced marriage. So of the 40 million people who are living in modern day slavery, about 15 million of those are women in a forced marriage. And of those, very high percentages are girls under the age of 18. I think it's something like 37% are girls under the age of 18, and of them about 44% are under the age of 15. And so when we think about forced marriage, often that includes rape, violence, forced labor. Certainly, my co-founder has talked a lot about getting a job once she was back in the U.S. and married at a bank and kind of working her way up the corporate ladder, eventually managing $2 billion in assets for PNC Bank and staffs of more than 200, and meanwhile going home and having to feel like she's entering a completely different world, having to provide all of the cooking, cleaning, service sort of work. So there's that component of it. Half of the people living in modern day slavery is the trafficking is related to sexual exploitation, which disproportionately affects women and girls. There are some areas where it's almost 100%. Some countries it's almost 100% people under the age of 18, girls under the age of 18. So very heavy disproportionate impact on women and girls, and that does point to something that I think almost any expert who's dealing with this would say, which is that there is this larger ecosystem around gender inequality that's creating unique vulnerability for women and girls that feeds that. So, as we continue the conversation, we can talk more about that. In terms of existing treaties, I mean, interestingly, there was a treaty on trafficking and exploitation in the 1940s, like shortly after the creation of the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But they did come around and create another one called one of the Palermo Protocols that goes along with a treaty on international crime. And so that did a few things to help define trafficking. So in particular, one of the interesting things that it said is that consent isn't relevant if it meets certain criteria. So someone has to have consciously acted to move someone into, by means of deception or force, into forced labor. And then whether or not someone's given consent, if they were deceived and they are in a forced labor situation, they couldn't have given consent. And it also outlines a lot of steps to combat it, although we were talking just before the panel about how has that actually functioned. I mean, you actually had some really interesting thoughts on that. Would you mind just sharing quickly? That you said there have been some pieces of it that have been really useful, but in other ways it's really broken down and hasn't been implemented very well.
Absolutely, I think one of the biggest things that Palermo Protocol did, and I think one of the saddest things about it is that it makes suggestions, not people, countries adhering by the protocol. They were agreeing to look at these suggestions and try to implement them.
Shall consider was used quite a lot.
Yeah, and it shall consider that the age of consent shall be 18 years old. Yet the age of consent in the state of Washington, how do you think it is, the age of consent? 16. You can consent to sex at the age of 16 in the state of Washington, which makes it an interesting perspective because somebody who can start being a victim of trafficking at age 16 in California can move to Washington for a lower bar, and here they can actually consent to sex, right? So you see that's what it did, but unfortunately became irrelevant because the United States has defaulted in the Palermo Protocols at many times. Every state has each age of consent and so much more.
Well, and when you said, I mean, globally 173 countries have signed the protocol, but you said 100% have defaulted on it.
Well, almost every country has defaulted on the age of consent to sex.
And nor is there any kind of scorecard tracking it. So they have a regular conference of state parties where everyone comes together and talks about it. But when you think about the function of a treaty and what makes it effective, a lot of times what you're really looking for is a name and shame. component, and if there isn't a clear scorecard, if there aren't clear metrics, clear proactive steps that states should be taking, what are you holding them accountable to? And I would point out, in the face of a $150 billion a year industry, 2/3 of which I believe is sexual exploitation, that there's a trust fund that's been established to implement this treaty, and they're bragging on their website that they have received $6.7 million to implement that treaty. I mean, just to put this in perspective, I appeared on Oprah in 2009, and we raised $6 million in a week from Oprah viewers. So if Oprah viewers are lapping the global community, we have a real problem. That's not a serious effort. There's no way you can implement everything that the beautiful language that they've included in the treaty, and in a lot of ways maps to some of the things that we'd like to see more broadly on violence against women. But without clear benchmarks and countries being held accountable, anyone even measuring it, and if you're not willing to fund it, then there are real limits. So nice first step, and there's a lot more they can do.
Yeah. Hopefully we can dive into some more what those steps could be.
Sure.
And some Q&A and follow-up. And now Shannon, last but not least, you talked earlier in your introduction about just the role of technology in business. And curious for you to unpack that more. How can business help be a driver for good? And how can technology and data help that effort?
Sure, yeah, we have the view that data is really at the core of this issue in terms of when we look at corporations and their procurement departments. If you were assigned as either a CSR director or someone in the procurement department to try to unpack your supply chain and understand the risks of forced labor in that supply chain, you would have to understand all the components that go into your supply chain, down to the raw materials that come in, as well as the services that come in. You would also have to probably reach across the aisle in terms of your finance department to get access to that data. And then you would have to go out into the world and figure out from all the suppliers and all of their suppliers where things come from. And so we believe if we can give people the tools to be able to have that view, they'll make better decisions, and we'll give them alternatives for that. And so that's really how we're using technologies to bring together all of these disparate data sources and to bring them together, cross-reference them across multiple companies that we work with and suppliers that we've identified. We talked a little bit about some of the legal pressures or the political pressures. That's something that is very helpful for us. So in Australia, with the Modern Slavery Act that they have, we actually have a number of companies coming to us saying, we need to understand this because we are accountable now to government to sign off that our supply chain is clean. And so we don't have that same kind of back pressure in many countries around the world. There are a couple of laws in California that help with some companies, but there aren't any national level laws other than the Australia. And even in Australia, there aren't really penalties associated with it. So a lot of it's guidance. But really what they've done is they've had their board of directors of each company has to sign off that they've actually looked at this issue, which is super, super helpful. And so I think there's many things here, but our belief is that if this could be as easy or close to as easy as using a search engine, that would be ideal from the perspective of our customers.
Yeah. And what type of data can be used for that?
So there's a lot of government reports, there's a lot of scraping of local media, social media. We actually do have multiple mechanisms for people on the ground. We call them like local whistleblowers to be able to identify what's happening on the ground in Africa or in Indonesia in terms of practices that they're seeing. We're investigating ways to compensate them either through micropayments or maybe giving them minutes on their cell phones. But really it's a multi-faceted source of information that we are constantly updating and scraping and pulling in. And that's what would be hard for someone inside of a company to be able to do.
Yeah. used to be a very manual, lengthy process, so lots
Yeah,
of
a lot,
opportunity.
it still is, a lot of it is still quite manual, but we're trying to automate as much of it as we could.
Well, thank you all for your response here. We have a number of other questions, but I think at this time, I'll open it up to the audience to see if there's any initial burning questions or anyone that would like to start something off. Either a question for the whole group, or you're welcome to ask any questions just directed at one of our specific panelists. We have a roving mic around the room, as this is being recorded, so we want to make sure that we capture your voice. Looks like we have one up front.
First of all, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. My question is, when I think about forced slavery, human trafficking and sex slaves and child brides, I also think about the demand side. These, wicked problems, they exist, these evils exist because there is a high demand for them. What is being done today to address, to eradicate demand for such things? Demand or organizations or gangs that facilitate human trafficking. How much consequence do they face, and are they are they being educated? Are they being just, I want to know what is being done to eradicate the demand for things. Thank you.
Shannon, that might be a great one for you to start out with.
Sure, so the demand equation is really at the core of what we're trying to focus on. So when it comes to purchasing decisions, if we can redirect a company's procurement processes toward a supplier that is clean in their practices and doesn't have forced labor in their supply chain, we inherently hurt those that do. And so that's really at the core for us in terms of cutting off the supply of money to those companies that are partaking in this. And I know, I'm sure you can speak to kind of the education side of, I know there's a lot of efforts Out Against Slavery and others have done relative to, in sex trafficking, educating both companies about the existence of this, the prevalence of it, particularly within the tech sector, and I think education is typically one of the core levers, and I know that's where you had talked about that.
I think we speak about the demand often, and we often speak about demand for sex, but not so much of the demand for free or cheap stuff. Most of everything drives labor trafficking, human trafficking. It's getting a product, it's getting something for free at a cheaper price, right? Like when you go to buy, what you look for the reduced price, or that thing that is cheap, that thing that comes at a lower cost, and so you can save some money. That drives the demand for labor trafficking. That drives the demand for other systematic issues that lead to human trafficking, right? When it comes to the demand that leads to labor trafficking, one of the things I think it starts at a consumer area, like at the regular community member, people who are in the community and who are actively buying products, right? It starts there. I'm not proud to say this, but I'm kind of proud. I know where every single piece of clothing that I'm wearing today, where it comes from. I did my research. It's not an easy thing I will tell you. I know where it comes from. I may pay $2-3 more to buy at a different location than to buy at one location, because we know where those pipelines of service come from, right? I make also consumer choices. I don't eat at Wendy's. I'm sorry, Wendy's. I will openly say this. Wendy's is one of the only fast food restaurants in the country that hasn't signed out to the first food product, because they don't want this to disclose where their tomatoes are coming from. Tomatoes is one of the products that is produced by forced labor around the world the most, right? And again, they want it cheap. They want to get that they want to get that fast and cheap. I think when it comes to the issue of demand for sex, it comes to a lot of education, right? I personally, in my work, I have chosen to focus on educating the community, understanding the realities of human trafficking, that leads into change of mind, that leads into the community being educated about the realities of human trafficking. I'm not going to go into perhaps details there because we're trying to stay good here. So I will stay within my wheelhouse, but I think it comes to the community being educated, aware, and making informed decisions and informed consumer choices. That is really what it comes down to, informed consumer choices.
So I'll address that in a couple of different ways. I'd love to share a story if I can, and this is from a throwback, from a different era in my life before I was a part of Every Woman Treaty that we were talking about, but it's a fun example of this, I think. So I came to this work as an activist on the Congo, and one of the things that was fueling the conflict in the Congo was Congo conflict minerals. So there was a lot of forced labor being used at the time, and conflict minerals were helping fund militias who were holding women as sex slaves, raping, murdering, massacres. And at the time, it was really considered, people all knew that tin, tantalum, and tungsten, and gold were in 100% of our consumer electronics products. And it was just something that people kind of shrugged off at the time, like, it's too complicated to trace it. And so then, in a bipartisan bill, I mean, Sam Brownback and Durbin came together and created this bill, Congo conflict minerals, that ultimately got attached to Dodd-Frank, which is the financial reform bill. And tech companies, I found out, were pushing back against it behind closed doors. They were saying, it's going to be too burdensome to industry, you can't ask us to track this. And so at the time, 45,000 people were estimated to be dying every month as a result of conflict minerals. So, and the estimated cost per product was about a penny. So my mom and I went out and got 45,000 pennies and cameras and took them to, first of all, I lived in Portland at the time, took them over to the Intel headquarters there, offering to pay for the first month's worth of lives. And we called the local radio station, went down, got in the car, drove to Silicon Valley, went to Apple, Hewlett-Packard, pitched press, ended up on NPR's Morning Edition, in the New York Times, talking about conflict minerals, which a lot of people didn't know about. And we knew that we had a lever there because in a lot of ways tech companies rely on innovation. Employees of tech companies are progressive, they want to believe that their company has good values, they want to feel good about that. And if you raise a question, you're actually, it causes an existential threat. Because if people don't believe in the company they're working for, you're going to have a problem. People aren't going to innovate, they're not going to want to work as hard. So we ended up taking this on the road. It got into a big confrontation at Apple headquarters with one of their PR ladies who's like, Apple doesn't have conflict minerals in their products. I'm like, you do, and you know it. Steve Jobs himself needs to speak out on this. I was like, this is going to be huge. Everyone's going to be talking about this. And at the time, it's like me and my mom and this woman, Diane, from Facebook. It's turned up. But interestingly, within 6 weeks of us doing those protests, like I said, we were in the New York Times. Nicholas Kristof did a piece on conflict minerals. We got several other pieces of press. Steve Jobs spoke out for the first time on conflict minerals. We couldn't talk about it at the time, but he actually called my colleague personally. We both sent him emails and he called to talk about it and invited the Enough Project to come and meet with him personally to talk about it. And the legislation passed. And when it passed, that meant that tech companies were now responsible for understanding their supply chain like 7 steps back, which was unprecedented at the time. So that public pressure and demand can really be affected by people, particularly. I'm a huge fan of a big Wendy's campaign that looks similar. We'll go get some pennies, you and me. We're gonna run there. But then I'd say the second piece of this is really important when we talk about demand, and I think we should just go ahead and go there and explain. There's some people refer to it as commercial sexual exploitation. It's called the Nordic model. So Sweden passed laws that basically say you should never arrest someone for being trafficked. You should never arrest someone who's involved in commercial sexual exploitation. And the other side of that is it should be criminal to purchase sex. And so that does have a big impact on demand. And there is a big conversation about the Nordic model. But I do also want to acknowledge that in the feminist movement, there's a big split, because there are also a lot of people who believe in that sex work should be legal, and really feel like the demand side if you go after the demand side too firmly, that it will end up having negative impact. So what I focus on is what can we all agree on here? Because I'm helping facilitate a process with feminists from all over the world who have different perspectives. What we can all agree on is that people shouldn't be arrested for being trafficked. That no one should be arrested for getting swept up in commercial sexual exploitation. The demand side of things in this debate can, literally, I was saying this before, I've had in the same week people on opposite sides like literally scream at me because they feel so strongly about it. People are very, very, very fired up on either pole, and it's a huge division inside the women's rights movement globally. So it's a very complex conversation.
Perhaps just to add to, you went there, I try not to go there, but I think you put it so beautifully that I felt like you were very.
You might as well acknowledge it, right?
Yeah, acknowledging the elephant in the room, right? I think when it comes to the end demand aspect of like the sex trafficking, then there's two things for me, right? As a survivor of human trafficking, I have to acknowledge that human trafficking is a power and control victimization. It seeks to take my autonomy and my self-governance away from me so somebody can hold that against me, right? As a survivor of human trafficking, who am I to get in the middle of somebody achieving autonomy and engage in sex work? And who am I to tell them that that is not good for them, right? Or it's not good for whatever, right? Because they are using their autonomy and self-governance to make a choice. I do acknowledge that, sex work or the sex industry itself, it's an industry that can be violent, that can be dangerous. But again, who am I to tell somebody you use your autonomy and self-governance to make that choice to self-sex, and that's a bad thing? No, the autonomy has been taken away from me. I will never get in between somebody achieving autonomy and using the self-governance to make a choice. I think that is where when it comes to that issue. But the reality is that also as an advocate for people in general, when we hyper focus on the demand or buyers of sex, we are forgetting one very important thing: the victim. We're forgetting the person. We're hyper focused on the demand and the people who are buying sex, and yet we're putting people on that corner who have been victimized by trafficking. My job is to pick those folks up and take them with me and try to provide them services, while somebody else is focused on perhaps other practices that I may disagree with.
I think very important to focus on both.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if I may add a couple of things. One, there have been some very effective interventions around demand here in Seattle. I can't tell, is there anybody here from REST?
REST is one of our network partners.
Yeah. So I know that they've done intervention education that's been incredibly effective. Like they have people, Johns, who go through their program and then want to come back and take the class again or end up becoming like facilitators, and that's very different than what you hear in the violence against women movement in general. Like education programs that are designed to reform abusers are not effective. The data just shows it just like doesn't work. So why there's a difference between those two things, I don't completely understand. But I also think it's really important to acknowledge that even in a place like Washington, 95% of people who are involved in commercial sex work have zero agency. So I think that we can get really distracted when we talk about legalizing sex work for people who are doing it with consent, away from the horrific violence that's happening to people who have zero agency, don't see a single dollar, are being trafficked. And to the extent, based on the people we've talked with who have been involved in creating the treaty, the notion that you would decriminalize pimps or traffickers, no way. And that's a component of that debate. And then you also have to ask some structural questions around who's funding, and I haven't looked into it, but there are questions about who's funding a lot of that movement as well. So if I have been exploited and I'm living in a developing country, and someone comes along and pays me a salary to speak out about legalizing sex work, there's some really, there's a lot of confusing boundaries there. So it's very complicated.
Well, we could dive in here more, but want to open it up for a minute first, in case we have any other questions in the room. Scott?
Hi, thank you all for your comments, and this is all very interesting to me, something I really didn't know about before. But Shannon, I just have a question for you, sort of about accountability and subcontracting in supply chains. So when I was at university as an undergraduate, the president of my university got ousted because he was building, well, the university was building a campus in the Middle East, and it was found out that he was sort of knew about subcontracting practices, and it was modern slaves were building the campus, and he was keeping it a secret. And that was really my first exposure to, oh wow, I had no idea that people could be in sort of in indentured servitude and building this, and it can all be covered. And then I was reading the New York Times recently, and they were talking about the boom in sort of food delivery in Europe, especially in England and France, and they focused in France with this company Deliveroo, and how they've been subcontracting a lot of their couriers, and a lot of them are asylum seekers from the Middle East. So really for them, they interviewed a lot of these undocumented migrants, and they said, well, this is absolutely fantastic because now we can get a job. But then if Deliveroo gets caught with this, they get in a massive scandal, and they can get fined by the French government. So how do you incorporate this sort of issue of, and this also can speak to IRC as well, this sort of migrant crisis in Europe, including them in the economies in a documented, official manner, and also not penalizing companies for not managing their subcontracting practices? Maybe I'm not asking it correctly. But
Well, I think there's a lot in there. A lot of what we're talking about is immigration and what, like, work visas, what's the immigration status of these workers, right, within a given country at a given time. And we try not to pass judgment on that per se, but we want to make it known to, in this case, maybe Deliveroo, that this practice is going on, that we have identified that you are hiring people that may be feeling forced to work, or perhaps they're happy about it, but it's not legal in the country. We don't try to pass judgment necessarily in interpreting laws, but we want to make that information available to them. Though what you're describing is, it's related to this discussion of agency, and is this someone working because they feel like it's the best thing for them to do in a given situation, and so there I think it bears going down to the lowest level possible and understanding, as you said, kind of what is the perspective from those workers. Do they have other options for work in those countries? But really it ends up understanding where are these things coming from, and put the Deliveroo manager in sort of arm that person with the data necessary to say, yes, we want to partake in this, and we're going to take it up to the EU to say this is what we're doing, and what we think it should be legal, or make a choice not to do that. That's sort of how we address it.
It's about informed decision making.
Right.
Perhaps 2 quick points to that. I think number one, thank you. When it comes to subcontracting, I think many companies do that, and a lot of it's coming down to again to wanted cheap labor, and it's easier to subcontract, and we see big companies doing that here. Even a third-party hiring companies that help people across the world coming with a visa and they're the ones that process their payments. And the company who's hiring the third-party company doesn't know what's happening and how people are being paid properly, what is their policy, because they don't care. All they care about is hiring somebody that can do the work at a lower price because of the bottom line, right? They're trying to save the money. Number two thing with that is that, yes, immigration status is playing a huge role on how people may experience human trafficking across the world, right? Perhaps to put it in context here, at the local level, we are serving currently just shy away from 200 people from 45 different countries. What that looks like to us is that those who are undocumented or underdocumented who are in our current caseload, 90%, I would dare to say 90% of them, the immigration status has been used against them. If you go and speak up, we're gonna call ICE. If you try to leave, we're gonna call ICE. If you try to leave, you're gonna call ICE. ICE is like, it's like water to them, right? Here you go, like everything, it comes to that. So I mean, for labor work, for example, right, like a good example, like saying, okay, it is okay to hire third-party companies or subcontractors, but make sure to also adhere to the principles of labor rights, human rights, and they're hiring people. I have no problem with hiring asylum seekers. I do believe that it's a good way for us to help people who are going through the process of asylum, but we have to hire people with the correct intentions, not to the intentions to get free labor or cheap labor, but to the correct intention of supporting people who are seeking asylum in this country, right? And asylum in the United States right now is one of the most highly publicized things. My brother's going through the asylum process right now. He had a hearing in May. He's not going to have a hearing until 2021 and October 2021. So you see, so that means that my brother cannot work for at least 2.5 years before his asylum hearing, right? T visas, for example, in the last year, we saw it go from anywhere from 16 months to 24 months. As of 3 weeks ago, a T visa to be adjudicated, a T visa trafficking protection visa given to immigrants who have experienced trafficking is taking 37 months. 37 months for a T visa to be adjudicated. What is that telling you? The system is failing, it's not working properly. So what we have now is that we have 200 people in our services who are going to depend on our services for a very long time, for up to 3 years maybe, or depending on how long it takes for us to get their T visa already. So and companies are unfortunately abusing that need to get the cheap labor.
Good point with that time of intention. Wonderful. Anyone else in the audience?
I'm in.
So
There you go.
It just takes it a minute to click in, I think.
it's just that I can't hear it. Okay. My name is Annette Gee. I'm from the University of Washington, and my question is about this whole notion of accountability and shining a light on and what can folks affiliated with Global Washington do about this. So I would really like to circle back to some of the themes that you've talked about already and maybe build on them. What other sectors of the local economy, folks at the university, folks in other sectors who are represented in Global Washington, possibly, what can you think that they can do individually and organizationally? What are your other suggestions before we close up the discussion today?
Do you mind if I get started?
No, it's all right.
Three asks, right? I think, and perhaps to the general public, I think be aware of the nuances of human trafficking, understand the differences between in human trafficking, right? Like not all sex work is human trafficking, not all smuggling is human trafficking, not all understand those issues and make appropriate consumer choices, right? Make informed consumer choices. That is the baseline that I think every consumer in this country can do. If for those who may have political influence, work with your local the senators, your state legislators, the local level, to ensure that we are passing sensible laws that look to empower all victims of human trafficking, no matter their immigration status, their sexual orientation, their color, the skin, or who they are in general, right? That's number two. And I think number three, it's really to, I don't know if, I'm just speaking in context for funders, right? The University of Washington, Global Washington, or those funders who have the ability to give money, give unrestricted dollars, right? Give unrestricted dollars that allow people to do the work that needs to be done. But also they also hold us accountable to ensure that the work that we are doing is adhering to the principles of people, or the principles of human rights, or labor rights, right? The IRC has a comprehensive package of labor rights, for example, that looks at, we are making sure that people in our pipelines are also not being forced to work, and just the same way we're protecting the people that we're serving. Perhaps that is one of the three things I would say you can do. But also be aware and understand the complexities of trafficking, and be an agent of change, right? We want people to have the correct and education about human trafficking and what really human trafficking is.
I mean, I would echo what Smears had said about, knowing where your clothes come from, right? What are all the things that you consume as a university? Where's the paper coming from? Where are people, how are they traveling? Where are they staying? The hospitality industry is a huge force in forced labor and sex trafficking. And yeah, I mean, anytime you kind of scratch your head and say, like, how could this be this cheap or this inexpensive? That's a sign that something might not be right in that. From a university perspective, perhaps there's research and projects that could be focused in this area that you could direct students to embark on. Just an idea.
So, my work at this point is really focused on global systems change. There's a woman who founded a group called Women Moving Millions, Chris Grum out of Portland, who has a sort of structure that she uses to think about this in terms of philanthropy. But I think when we think about how we're intervening, it's an important framework to keep in mind. She talks about giving 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 1.0 being kind of emergency response. So that would be like the shelters, the services, that kind of thing. 2.0 being a place that I think we've really gotten stalled out in the international women's movement, which is around individual, I'm going to put it in quotes because I don't like the word empowerment, but individual education, individual economic empowerment to be able to go on. But the 3.0 is systems change, and that is not a place that many people are looking or investing. That's very, very, very important. It's tricky when we talk about modern day slavery, because there is a treaty that exists. Obviously, we've talked about some of those limits. So I can describe a little more about what we're going after with the treaty. We talk about it as the whole hand framework, that sort of multi-sectoral approach. So if you think of the palm of the hand as being sort of the data, the monitoring as being kind of the core of it, and then 4 key prongs. 1 is cleaning up the legal code in every country. Number 2, training and accountability for police, judges, but also doctors and nurses. Services and prevention education, so those things in concert. But you can only get these things done if you fund it. I mean, right now, if you look at the funding for gender equality, we know this industry's $150 billion a year. All investment by multilaterals in gender equality is about $44 billion a year. And that includes all kinds of interventions that are being tagged as having a secondary impact on gender. So that's not even their primary purpose. Primary funding that's primarily geared toward gender equality is only $4 billion a year. And they just came out with a number that it's only $400 million a year globally that's dedicated to ending violence against women. Which is by far the most widespread human rights violation on earth. So, from our perspective, we have to get serious about funding it, and that is very much going to be, multiple actors. So what we envision is creating a global fund modeled after some other global funds, like for AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, that would be $4 billion a year, dedicated to ending violence against women, which would include some of this very worthy programming that we're talking about here. And that would actually go a long way to be able to pay for the training for police, the services, the prevention education that's not being invested in right now. But that will only be created, I would say about half of that would come from governments, the other half would come from corporations that could invest in that. So I think to the extent anybody here has influence over where you personally are putting your philanthropic dollars, however seemingly small, or the larger systems that you're a part of, getting them to invest, that's key. It's absolutely key. People have to put their money where their mouth is, and they are not doing it right now. You cannot solve this problem without putting money into it. We've got to be willing to invest. So I think that's key.
Can I just add something? I think you did, I just kind of put that really quick. And make sure your money is not political too. It's not it's I think when it comes to these issues of human rights and gender-based violence, human trafficking, and so much more, when our money is often guided by geopolitics or by politics itself, make sure the money is actually guided by the principles of human rights, of advocacy, supporting people, and making sure that people have or rebuild or build a life without victimization.
Yeah, I mean, I will say by extension, if I may, just that when they created clearly the protocol on trafficking didn't generate a lot of funds. When they created the treaty on landmines, the funding was right around that same level, like $8 to $10 million a year. Within 36 hours of introducing the treaty, they had $500 million in commitments. And the budget stayed at $400 to $500 million per year every year since, and it's been more than 20 years. But one of the things that they wrote into the treaty, which I thought was so great, is that money does not have to flow through some sort of big international body. It can go directly to those frontline groups that are doing the incredible work. So that's something we'd like to see in the structure.
Thank you for all of those. We're approaching time. We're going to have one more question here as we get to 4:30 today, but I know I saw several hands up. So just want to give a quick opportunity, maybe some folks that have a burning question, if we could just, there were 2 or 3, you could quickly call them out, and maybe just in some brief response, we can kind of combine them all together.
There was a question somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Unless they were just answered, I saw 2 or 3.
I have a question for Shannon, actually, and it's jumping off of Samir's, your comments about companies wanting free labor or cheap labor. What have you found to be companies' response when you do actually put all of this data in front of them and it turns out some aspect of what they're doing isn't as clean as they thought or that they wanted? Have you found that the responses are typically, great, thanks for letting us know, we'll now put in whatever dollars that we didn't think we'd have to spend on this issue in order to clean it up? And now the response is, great, thanks, and then a little bit more defensive or just not wanting to respond or not wanting to address that issue?
Yeah, it's we've had all of those responses. I think that most often the response is, okay, now what? What do we do? What suppliers should we work with? We still need to produce the products that we produce. We still need to make computers. We still need to make batteries, whatever it is. And so please help us. Please help us find a supplier of cobalt that isn't littered with forced labor and slavery. And so a lot of the work that we end up doing is in this mitigation phase or in this sort of consulting of how to rethink about the supply chain. But we have also had customers who've gotten the report. There are clearly issues there, and they don't want to engage after that. And that's disheartening, but we do feel like it's important for them to see that and we believe that ultimately they will evolve and make some changes. But you're right. I mean, like as I said earlier, having back pressure of legislation helps quite a bit, and so that's another vector, lobbying, that probably we need to be more involved in. But yeah, typically the response is, what can we do? We've got this problem. What can we do? And oftentimes it is this web of companies and fronts of companies and subcontractors and what have you. And increasingly, what we're building is the database of alternatives that are cleaner for companies to work with. So that's what we do.
Well, I think this is the last one, unless anything else is burning, and then we'll just combine them together.
Hello?
Yes, great. Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I think a lot of you in different ways have emphasized the importance of a multidisciplinary approach or a systems response. Yet each of you are working on different aspects of ending modern day slavery. So if you talk about the policy aspect or the service provision or prevention in terms of the supply chain, these are all different aspects. We haven't even talked about the prosecution elements as well. So the question to you is, given the importance of a systems approach or a coordinated response, what is the best place to target that coordination? Is it at the local level? Is it at the state level? Is it at the national level? Is it at the global level? Of course, the easy response is to say all, yes, everything. But in terms of, say, strategic impact or a starting point in terms of where we are now, what would be your recommendation, or what is your perspective in terms of where that coordination or systems building, if you will, can have the best impact? Thanks.
That's a beautiful question.
For us, the most effective has been at the national level, and so in a perfect world we would have Sarbanes-Oxley style legislation for companies that, in terms of their reporting practices, that they would have to be similar to what Australia has done with the Modern Slavery Act, but hasn't yet put teeth into it as far as penalties go. But for us, in terms of managing corporations and the reporting that their board of directors must sign off on, that they've looked at this issue and that they attest that they have done diligence to make sure that their supply chains are clean, that has been the most effective form for us.
Perhaps I will recommend a two-pronged approach, right? Like with the idea of like think globally, act locally, perhaps, but perhaps addressing two different parts of the issue, right? You have at the local level you can address the people who have already been impacted by trafficking, and at the global level you can actually perhaps provide education, prevention, and information around human trafficking, right? Especially about this issue of human trafficking, because at the end of the day, when you're thinking globally, I think that people all around the world are experiencing human trafficking. We have 40 million people all over the world, right? But I do think that when companies they have offices or have stores around across the world, we should have programming at the local level, but also thinking at the national and international level. At the local level, you can find programming. At the national and international level, you can find prevention and education. And perhaps a big ask for a local and national level is that for every dollar nonprofits like ours get from the federal government, it's actually attached, it has a strings attached. For every dollar, we have to make up 25 cents in donations. It is very difficult to get money nowadays, especially when you're tackling the whole issue of human trafficking, right? If we get $750,000 from the government for 3 years, we have to make up $250,000 in donation in 3 years, which is very difficult. Again, and perhaps not to sidetrack us here, but it's easier for us if we're only to focus on sex trafficking. Easy, we can come up with $250,000, but because we focus on all forms of trafficking and because of the politics attached to immigration and other issues right now, it's becoming a lot more difficult. So again, the multi-level faceted, but also acknowledging that a prevention without capacity to serve people who have already been impacted by trafficking is not effective.
So, I think the most relevant thing is not where people should be focusing or what would be ideal if only those people would do it, but ask the more pragmatic question, what's it going to take to get people who would not otherwise act to engage? And so treaties only exist. The benefit of a treaty like this is only for it to exist, for it to be implemented beautifully at the domestic and local level. The question is, are governments going to do it without a treaty? And the answer is they haven't. Nor has anyone been able to catalyze the kind of resources that we need in order to get the job done. And that's why we're focused globally, because we know that a given country just isn't going to engage in that sort of comprehensive, multi-sectoral reform domestically unless there's a reason to. And for whatever reason, And I don't know why, countries seem to care a lot about what other countries think. Like, for instance, weirdly, if you include in a treaty that there's a mechanism for other state parties to provide feedback on how they think another state party is doing, it's implemented better. Okay, and then nobody even ever uses it, but it seems to make a big difference, right? So they do care what other people think. And so what we're thinking about is leverage. Like, where do we have the leverage to actually get people who would not otherwise act to do it? But there's no question that comprehensive national legislation is what you need, and I think the parallel that I would put forward is around domestic violence. In nations that have implemented comprehensive domestic violence reform, actually not even comprehensive, just like, do they have a law, don't they have a law? 32% lower mortality rate for adult women. And they've controlled in those studies for, this is the World Bank's reports, they've controlled for education and income level. So, sort of comprehensive reform where basically what you're asking for, and this is what we want the treaty to ask every nation to do, is you create a national coordinating body that's also helping bridge the gap between national and local, right? For instance, in Brazil, when they did comprehensive reform on violence against women, they established a national hotline. They established communication channels between agencies that were dealing with these things, you know, the local task forces. That's where the work happens, but the question is how do you get people to do the work, which is why we're focusing on the global.
And I think we've talked about a lot of things that are needed to be creating change, and the change that we want to end modern slavery, talking about awareness, education, policy, reform. Curious, given all those needs, my closing question to all of you are, how optimistic are you? Where do you think we are, or where do you think we're headed? And do you have optimism for the future that we can end modern slavery?
Well, we really are if we didn't feel that way. I mean, I think I mean, there certainly are days where you look at it and you feel like, wow, this is really untenable, you know, because the motivation for it, the economic motivation for it alone is very compelling. And so, but you do, like, at least from my experiences, we work with individual companies and we see, you know, reaction to data and decisions that are changed. I do have faith that ultimately we can end this. In terms of, I do at least in terms of the corporate economic incentives or that engine, I feel like we can change that.
I am optimistic, yet I do think that we have a ways to go when it comes to the private sector. In the private sector, personally, I mean, and probably this is my selfish way, as I am a working nonprofit. So it's for the private sector to take a bigger perhaps social responsibility to the issue of human trafficking, right? How it's impacted, you know, we want, for example, you do notice this very beautifully, the hospitality industry, hotels think that only sex trafficking happens there, yet they're not looking at the pipeline of actually people being forced to work against the realtor hotels. You know, and I think, and that is how perhaps companies and private agencies can actually own up to the issue. The problem with owning up to the issue is that then it makes you do something about it, right? If we have companies actually say there is a problem, there is an issue, I must do something about it, I think that is where we kind of see a bigger impact or a bigger step forward when it comes to addressing human trafficking, when it comes to really end, if we're seeking to end human trafficking, it's going to take a social change, a legislative change, and a educational change is going to take. We have to address gender-based violence. We have to address poverty, systematic racism, sexism. We have to address every single aspect of society that looks to systematically oppress people, that then puts them literally in a pedestal. Here you go, here's your prey to trafficking, right? When I look at our clients, the people that we serve every day, when we look at the vulnerabilities, boom, systematic racism is there, sexism is there, gender-based violence is there. Every element of oppression, it is in every single person that I have, that we work with. Not only, well, I'm optimistic, I do feel that the private sector needs to step up more and acknowledge those issues. perhaps without getting too into it and running the risk of pissing some people off. We live in Seattle, a prominent tech company, right? What happens when you have a big tech companies in Seattle? We bring talent from other countries. Then the talent brings a family member who perhaps is not accustomed or is not fully aware of their rights in this country. And you know, we see a number of people who are brought here on spouses visas of somebody who working for a tech company and that abusing their wife and that putting them in a domestic servitude situation. Those companies must take responsibility for what they're doing, because at the end of the day, we are the people. We are here to provide services to people, but they are responsible for the system and the social aspect of it, of bringing folks in here. I'm not opposed to that, but companies must take responsibility for those actions and how that leads to communities feeling unsafe, to people being oppressed and being experiencing trafficking to those pipelines.
So, the thing about violence against women is that it's absolutely a solvable problem. I mean, the data is super clear, even though it's scarce, it's very clear. I mean, and I would just say, I mentioned my co-founder, Vidya, who lived through this forced marriage. One of the things that we go back to often is that it's true she educated herself, she got an MBA, it's true she empowered herself economically, and was managing all these assets. It took her 22 years to get out of that forced marriage. If she had known her rights when she was 18, she could have just walked to the embassy in India, in Madras, and gotten a plane ticket home. There was no reason for her to have lived through 22 years of abuse. And so when we think about some simple interventions, like when young women know their rights, when young men know that other men will judge them and shame them for abusing women, for purchasing sex, or what have you, then we're in a very different place. So the data is super clear. To me, that's not, can we end violence against women? Well, I mean, we're never going to end 100%. There are always going to be sociopaths out there, right? But could we vastly reduce it? Absolutely. That's not even a question. We just have to decide we're ready to. And what I think about, and it's going to sound like a weird parallel, is polio. Again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's happened with polio, but it started with a few Rotary clubs in the Philippines. They just decided they were going to go do some immunizations. And then other Rotary clubs decided to do that. And then it grew. And before you know it, Rotary is the second largest private funder of the World Health Organization, partnering with the Gates Foundation. They serve on this sort of board of 5 bodies that are managing polio eradication, and within the next few years we will have a polio-free world, because people got together and decided they were not willing to wake up in a world that allows children to die of polio. Period. So the thing that's been really encouraging to me, and the reason that I'm optimistic, is that in my journey as an activist, as I've sort of stumbled my way through it, we've just had ridiculous success every time we've tried. And I don't know what that is. Like when I flew to Mogadishu with 10 women pledging $30 or 30 women pledging $10 a month. How were we able to break the silence on rape and end up on the cover of the New York Times and have women's rights written into the Constitution there? I don't know. How was it my mom and I, hauling around these pennies, ended up, helping pass this legislation that totally changed the way we think about supply chains? I don't know. I mean, we were going up against some of the biggest tech lobbies in the world, and we won. It was ridiculous. That stuff happens every single day. So what just always shocks me, and it's probably the reason that I've taken on this ridiculously ambitious campaign, we're just going to go out and do this treaty and raise billions of dollars. Because it really actually only takes a few people to get that sort of thing done. I mean, we've spent a lot of time building a global coalition, making sure it's grassroots up, being methodical about it, but it really just takes people, regular folks who are sitting in this room deciding you're going to just doggedly go after some aspect of it and engage. And my work started with just wanting to do a little run to raise money. And then I took the next step and the next step and the next step, and before you know it, it's a life work. So the incredible thing is every single person sitting in this room absolutely, without question, has the capacity to change the world. The question is that what you're going to choose for yourself? So that's what I would end on.
Well said. Wow.
Well,
Are we
thank
supposed
you
to check to see if they are
to the
trained?
three of you. Had some outstanding discussion today, and I think while we did talk about these complex systems and so much that needs to change within corporations, across governments, it is exciting to think about the optimism that you and many of us carry, to think about the actions that we can each take as individuals. We heard a lot about informed decision-making and purchases. We heard about change needed in companies, and as each of us sit in our own companies and work with others, think about the actions that we can take, and that little things can be so impactful. So I think on that note, we will wrap this discussion up here, but just thank you again to our panelists. But before we do go, we have an announcement also as we think more just about how can we continue this discussion, how can we continue to stay informed. I'd like to bring up Alex Pearson to talk about an exciting video that's being released soon.
Hi, thank you all. So my name is Alex Pearson. I am an impact producer with Vulcan Productions. And I want to just tell you briefly about our new documentary film, Ghost Fleet, which looks at forced labor in the seafood industry. The film follows an incredible group of activists who are fighting for justice and freedom for enslaved fishermen in Indonesia and Thailand. And while the story takes place on the other side of the world, as you've heard, these consequences are global. With the release of this film, we are advocating for increased transparency in the seafood supply chain, and we are asking all viewers of this film to share these stories and to ask where your seafood comes from. Ask who caught it. So I'm happy to say that this film is opening in theaters this July 30th here in Seattle at SIF Uptown Cinema. And if you're interested to learn more about this film and to find ways to use it as a tool in your work, please go to ghostfleet.com or please come corner me after this. And thank you.
Hi, my name is Sherry Yoon, and I'm with the World Affairs Council. On behalf of Global Washington and the World Affairs Council, we would like to thank everyone for coming to today's event, and also special thanks to our speakers and moderator for such an engaging and informative discussion. I hope you really enjoyed this event, and I hope you will attend our future events. You can learn about our upcoming events by going to our websites, globalwa.org and world-affairs.org. Thank you so much again.